My husband divorced me by email while I was standing in a cafe in Paris, and when I checked our bank account, every dollar we had was gone. I remember staring at the screen not because I didn't understand the words, but because I understood them too well. The subject line was simple. No emotion. No explanation. Just final notice. Richard had always liked things neat and efficient. Even the end of a 42-year marriage, apparently, could be reduced to a few cold sentences sent across an ocean. I read it once. Then again. Then I set my phone down beside my untouched coffee, the steam curling into the air like nothing had changed, like the world hadn't just tilted beneath my feet. Around me, people laughed, glasses clinked, a waiter called out an order in French. Life continued. It always does. I picked up my phone again and opened our banking app. It took 3 seconds to load. 3 seconds for everything I thought was secure to disappear. The balance read 0. Not low. Not reduced. 0. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just stared at the number, waiting for it to correct itself, as if it were a mistake, a glitch, something temporary that would resolve if I refreshed the screen. I refreshed it twice. Stayed the same. That's when I noticed the transaction history. Multiple transfers. Large amounts. All completed within the last 24 hours. Clean. Methodical. Planned. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the narrow Paris street, sunlight catching on the windows of old buildings, people passing by without a second glance. I had spent the past week here, telling myself this trip was something I deserved. A quiet anniversary getaway, even if Richard had insisted he was too busy to come. You go ahead, he'd said, barely looking up from his laptop. We'll celebrate when you get back. I believed him. I always believed him. My phone buzzed again. A message this time. Not from Richard. From an unknown number back home. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. It was a photo. Just one. My house. No, our house. The white colonial on Maplewood Drive. The one we'd spent decades paying off, renovating, filling with every version of our lives. But something was wrong. The front door was open, and there standing in the doorway was a woman I had never seen before. She wasn't carrying boxes. She wasn't visiting. She was standing there like she belonged. The message beneath the photo was short. I thought you should know. I looked at the image again, this time slower. Her hand rested casually on the door frame. Comfortable. Familiar. As if she had done it 100 times before. I zoomed in. Inside, I could see the edge of my living room. My furniture. My curtains. Everything exactly where I left it. Except now there was someone else standing in the middle of it. I set my phone down carefully on the table, aligning it with the edge like I needed something, anything to feel controlled. Around me the cafe hadn't changed. The same laughter. The same music. The same sunlight. But something inside me had shifted quietly, completely. I reached for my coffee and took a sip. It had gone cold. I didn't react. I just set it back down and opened my email again, reading Richard's message one more time, slower this time, as if there might be something hidden between the lines. There wasn't. Just legal language. Finality. Distance. He had already moved on. He had already taken everything. And he had done it while I was thousands of miles away, alone, distracted, trusting that the life I had built was still waiting for me. I closed the email. Then I opened my airline app. My return ticket was scheduled for the following week. I changed it. Tonight. No hesitation. No second thought. My fingers moved steadily, confirming the new flight, selecting my seat, processing the payment from a card he clearly hadn't thought to cancel. When the confirmation screen appeared, I allowed myself a small breath. Not relief. Not yet. Just clarity. I picked up my phone one last time and looked at the photo of my house. At her. At the open door. Then I locked the screen and stood up, smoothing my coat as if I were simply finishing a quiet afternoon coffee. No one around me knew what had just happened. No one needed to. I walked out into the Paris street, the air crisp against my face, and for the first time since reading that email, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Something colder. Something sharper. Richard thought distance made me powerless. He thought silence meant I would accept it. He was wrong. And by the time I stepped back into that house, he was going to understand exactly how wrong he was. I did not sleep on the plane. I closed my eyes, but my mind stayed wide awake, replaying every small moment from the past 6 months as if they were scenes I had missed the first time around. Richard sitting at the edge of the bed, typing late into the night, the glow of his laptop lighting half his face while the other half stayed in shadow. The way he would angle the screen slightly away when I walked in, subtle enough that I never questioned it. The way he started taking calls outside, stepping onto the back patio even when the weather was cold. I told myself he needed privacy. I told myself after 42 years, trust did not need to be questioned. I see now that trust was exactly what he was counting on. The hum of the airplane engine filled the cabin, steady and constant, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, watching the dark window reflect my own face back at me. I looked composed. That surprised me. I expected to see something different. Panic, grief, anger. But there was none of that. Just stillness. I thought about the bank account again. About the precision of it. Richard had not acted impulsively. He had planned this. The transfers were not random. They were spaced out, deliberate, as if he had been preparing for this moment for weeks, maybe longer. I remembered a conversation from 3 months ago, sitting at the kitchen table while he reviewed what he called routine financial adjustments. He had asked me to sign a few documents, nothing complicated, just updates. He said something about streamlining accounts, making things easier for tax season. I signed them without reading closely. I trusted him to handle those things. He always had. That memory settled heavily now, not as regret, but as clarity. This did not begin with an email. It began long before that, in quiet decisions, in small shifts I chose not to see. A flight attendant walked by and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. My voice felt unnecessary. Everything that needed to be understood had already been said without words. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I opened my phone again, scrolling through old messages from Richard. They had changed gradually. Shorter. More practical. Less warmth. I had told myself it was just age, just routine settling in the way long marriages sometimes do. I never imagined that distance was being created on purpose. I reached the message from 2 weeks before my trip. Enjoy Paris. You deserve it. I remember smiling when I read that. I remember thinking how thoughtful it sounded. Now it felt different. Calculated. Like he needed me gone. Needed the space. Needed the time. I locked my phone again and leaned back, letting my head rest against the seat. Around me, other passengers slept, watched movies, flipped through magazines. Ordinary lives moving forward. I wondered how many of them were returning home to something they still believed was waiting for them. When the plane finally began its descent, I felt a shift inside me, quiet but firm. Not dread. Not fear. Something more controlled. I had spent years building that house, managing that life, supporting that man. If he thought he could erase that with a few transactions and a message sent across an ocean, then he had misunderstood something fundamental about me. The plane touched down just after dawn. The sky was pale, the air cool as I stepped outside the terminal, pulling my coat tighter around me. I did not call anyone. I did not announce my return. I ordered a car and gave the driver my address. He nodded, entered it into his system, and we drove in silence through streets that felt both familiar and slightly distant, as if I were seeing them from the outside for the first time. As we turned onto Maplewood Drive, I noticed how ordinary everything looked. The same trimmed lawns. The same mailboxes. The same quiet rhythm of a neighborhood waking up. Nothing about it suggested that anything had changed. That was the thing about betrayal. It rarely announces itself loudly. It settles into the ordinary, disguises itself as routine, and by the time you recognize it, it has already taken root. The car slowed in front of my house. I did not move right away. I looked at it carefully, taking in every detail. The curtains. The front steps. The door. Closed now. Calm. As if the photo I received had been just a moment already past. I reached for my bag, paid the driver, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air felt colder here. Sharper. I stood there for a second, adjusting my grip on the handle, grounding myself in something simple and physical. Then I walked toward the front door. Each step steady, measured, without hesitation. Whatever was waiting for me on the other side. I was ready to see it clearly. I did not sleep on the plane. I closed my eyes, but my mind stayed wide awake, replaying every small moment from the past 6 months as if they were scenes I had missed the first time around. Richard sitting at the edge of the bed, typing late into the night, the glow of his laptop lighting half his face while the other half stayed in shadow. The way he would angle the screen slightly away when I walked in, subtle enough that I never questioned it. The way he started taking calls outside, stepping onto the back patio even when the weather was cold. I told myself he needed privacy. I told myself after 42 years, trust did not need to be questioned. I see now that trust was exactly what he was counting on. The hum of the airplane engine filled the cabin, steady and constant, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, watching the dark window reflect my own face back at me. I looked composed. That surprised me. I expected to see something different. Panic, grief, anger. But there was none of that. Just stillness. I thought about the bank account again. About the precision of it. Richard had not acted impulsively. He had planned this. The transfers were not random. They were spaced out, deliberate, as if he had been preparing for this moment for weeks, maybe longer. I remembered a conversation from 3 months ago, sitting at the kitchen table while he reviewed what he called routine financial adjustments. He had asked me to sign a few documents, nothing complicated, just updates. He said something about streamlining accounts, making things easier for tax season. I signed them without reading closely. I trusted him to handle those things. He always had. That memory settled heavily now, not as regret, but as clarity. This did not begin with an email. It began long before that, in quiet decisions, in small shifts I chose not to see. A flight attendant walked by and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. My voice felt unnecessary. Everything that needed to be understood had already been said without words. Somewhere over the Atlantic I opened my phone again, scrolling through old messages from Richard. They had changed gradually. Shorter. More practical. Less warmth. I had told myself it was just age, just routine settling in the way long marriages sometimes do. I never imagined that distance was being created on purpose. I reached the message from 2 weeks before my trip. Enjoy Paris. You deserve it. I remember smiling when I read that. I remember thinking how thoughtful it sounded. Now it felt different. Calculated. Like he needed me gone. Needed the space. Needed the time. I locked my phone again and leaned back, letting my head rest against the seat. Around me, other passengers slept, watched movies, flipped through magazines. Ordinary lives moving forward. I wondered how many of them were returning home to something they still believed was waiting for them. When the plane finally began its descent, I felt a shift inside me, quiet but firm. Not dread. Not fear. Something more controlled. I had spent years building that house, managing that life, supporting that man. If he thought he could erase that with a few transactions and a message sent across an ocean, then he had misunderstood something fundamental about me. The plane touched down just after dawn. The sky was pale, the air cool as I stepped outside the terminal, pulling my coat tighter around me. I did not call anyone. I did not announce my return. I ordered a car and gave the driver my address. He nodded, entered it into his system, and we drove in silence through streets that felt both familiar and slightly distant, as if I were seeing them from the outside for the first time. As we turned onto Maplewood Drive, I noticed how ordinary everything looked. The same trimmed lawns. The same mailboxes. The same quiet rhythm of a neighborhood waking up. Nothing about it suggested that anything had changed. That was the thing about betrayal. It rarely announces itself loudly. It settles into the ordinary, disguises itself as routine, and by the time you recognize it, it has already taken root. The car slowed in front of my house. I did not move right away. I looked at it carefully, taking in every detail. The curtains. The front steps. The door. Closed now. Calm. As if the photo I received had been just a moment already past. I reached for my bag, paid the driver, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air felt colder here. Sharper. I stood there for a second, adjusting my grip on the handle, grounding myself in something simple and physical. Then I walked toward the front door, each step steady, measured, without hesitation. Whatever was waiting for me on the other side, I was ready to see it clearly. I stood in front of the door for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel the weight of that moment completely before stepping inside. My house. My life. Or at least what used to be. I reached into my purse and pulled out my key, the same one I had carried for decades, the metal worn slightly smooth from years of use. I inserted it into the lock and turned it slowly. It still fit. It still worked. That somehow felt important. The door opened without resistance. The familiar scent of my home greeted me first, but it was different now, layered with something unfamiliar, something that did not belong. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with a soft click. For a brief second, everything looked the same. The hallway table, the framed photos on the wall, the light filtering in through the front windows. Then I noticed the details. A pair of shoes by the stairs that were not mine. A handbag resting on the chair where I used to leave my coat. A faint trace of perfume in the air that I did not recognize. I set my suitcase down carefully beside the door, placing it upright as if I were returning from any ordinary trip. I did not call out. I did not announce myself. I simply listened. Voices drifted in from the kitchen. Low, casual, comfortable. I walked toward them, my steps quiet against the hardwood floor, each one deliberate. As I reached the doorway, I stopped just before entering, allowing myself a clear view without being immediately seen. Richard stood at the counter, his back partially turned, pouring coffee into a mug I had bought years ago from a small shop during a trip we once took together. Across from him, seated at the table, was the woman from the photograph. She looked exactly the same. Relaxed. At ease. As if she had always belonged there. She laughed at something he said, a soft, easy sound, and he smiled in return. That smile. I had not seen it directed at me in a long time. I stepped into the doorway then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for my presence to register. It did not take long. The woman noticed first. Her expression shifted, not into panic but into something more controlled, more assessing. She straightened slightly in her chair, her eyes moving over me quickly, as if measuring who I was against what she had been told. Richard turned a second later. For a brief moment something flickered across his face. Surprise. Then calculation. Then nothing at all. You are back early, he said, as if I had returned from a weekend trip, as if nothing about this situation required explanation. I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the details I had overlooked before. The new shirt. The slight tension in his posture. The way he held the coffee mug just a little tighter than necessary. Then I shifted my gaze to the woman. She met my eyes without hesitation. Confident. Comfortable. Prepared. I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before setting my purse down on the entry table. I changed my flight, I said, my voice steady, even the same tone I might use to comment on the weather. No accusation. No emotion. Just fact. Silence settled into the room. Not heavy, not explosive, just present. I walked further inside, moving past them into the living room, letting my hand brush lightly against the back of the sofa as I passed. Everything was still in place, but it felt different, like a stage set after the actors had been replaced. I turned slowly, facing them again, giving myself a full view of the scene. My home. My husband. And a stranger sitting at my table as if she had every right to be there. I let the moment stretch just long enough to be understood. Then I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly. Are you done? The question hung in the air, simple and precise. It was not directed at one of them. It was directed at both. At whatever story they had created in my absence. Richard set his mug down on the counter, the sound quiet but distinct. The woman shifted slightly in her seat, her composure still intact, but no longer as effortless as before. I watched them both, not waiting for an explanation, not expecting one. Because in that moment, I already knew everything I needed to know. The email. The empty account. The open door. This. All of it was connected. And for the first time since I stepped off that plane, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me. Not confusion. Not hurt. Clarity. They thought this was finished. They thought I had already been removed from the story. But they had made one mistake. They had done all of this while I was still here to see it. And that meant it was not over. Not even close. I watched the confusion settle into Richard's face, slow and unfamiliar, like something he had not practiced for. That was new. For years he had always been one step ahead in every conversation, every decision, every quiet shift in our life. But now there was a pause, a hesitation, and in that hesitation something opened. I turned away from them without another word and walked toward the staircase, my hand gliding lightly along the railing as I moved upward. The house felt different from this angle, not because it had changed, but because I was no longer moving through it the same way. I was not returning. I was assessing. Each step creaked in the same familiar rhythm, but now I heard it clearly, as if I had been too distracted before to notice. When I reached the top, I did not look back. I did not need to. Their presence lingered below, uncertain, waiting for something from me that I was not going to give. I walked down the hallway and pushed open the bedroom door. It was almost exactly as I had left it. Almost. My suitcase from the trip I had taken was gone from the corner where I usually kept it, replaced by a different one, sleeker, unfamiliar. The bed was made, but not the way I made it. The pillows were arranged differently, too precise, too intentional. There was a scent in the room that did not belong to me. I stepped inside slowly, taking in each detail without reacting to any of them. On the dresser, my jewelry box sat slightly open. I walked over and lifted the lid. Most of it was still there. Not all. I closed it gently, placing my hand on top for a moment, not in grief but in acknowledgement. This had been going on longer than I allowed myself to see. I moved to the closet next. When I opened it, the change was clearer. My clothes had been shifted to one side, compressed, reduced. The other half of the space was filled with items that were not mine. Different fabrics. Different colors. Different choices. Someone had made room for herself here. Not temporarily. Permanently. I reached out and touched one of the hangers, sliding it slightly along the rod, listening to the soft scrape of plastic against metal. It was such a small sound, but it echoed louder than anything they had said downstairs. I let the hanger settle back into place and closed the closet door. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed. Not heavily. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel its firmness beneath me. This bed had held decades of quiet conversations, shared routines, the ordinary closeness of a long life built side by side. Now it felt like a piece of furniture in a staged room, stripped of everything that had given it meaning. I placed my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead, allowing the silence to fill the space completely. That was when the final piece settled into place. Not the betrayal. Not the money. Not even the woman downstairs. Those were outcomes. This was something else. This was intent. Richard had not just planned to leave. He had planned to replace. To erase. To make it as if I had never existed in this space at all. And for a moment I considered what he must have felt while doing it. Not guilt. Not hesitation. But certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from believing the other person will not fight back. That they will accept the version of reality presented to them because it is easier than challenging it. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my coat as I did, even though it did not need smoothing. Habit. Control. I walked to the window and looked out over the backyard, the same view I had seen every morning for years. The trees. The fence. The small garden I had maintained each season. Nothing out there had changed. The world beyond this house continued exactly as it always had. That steadiness felt important. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the door, pausing only briefly as my eyes passed over the room one last time. Not with attachment. Not anymore. With clarity. When I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear their voices again, lower now, more cautious. They were talking about me. Of course they were. Trying to decide what I would do next. Trying to predict something they no longer understood. I walked back down the stairs at the same measured pace, each step deliberate, controlled. When I reached the bottom, I did not return to the kitchen immediately. Instead, I stopped in the living room, reaching for the phone on the side table. I picked it up, dialed a number from memory and held it to my ear. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Calm. Professional. Reliable. This is Margaret Collins, I said, my tone steady, unchanged. I need to review everything. Today. I listened for a moment, nodding once even though they could not see me. Yes, I added. All of it. I ended the call and set the phone back in its place, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table. Then I turned toward the kitchen. Richard and Vanessa both looked up as I entered. their expressions no longer confident, no longer certain. I met their eyes briefly, just long enough to let them see what had changed. Not in the house. Not in them. In me. You should make plans, I said quietly. Things are about to get complicated. And for the first time since I walked through that door, I saw it clearly. Not control. Not dominance. But the beginning of something they had not prepared for. I did not wait for them to respond. I did not need to hear their questions, their explanations, or whatever version of the truth they were preparing to offer. I walked past them again, this time toward the study at the end of the hallway, the room Richard had always treated as his domain. For years I respected that boundary. I knocked before entering. I waited until he invited me in. It seemed like a small courtesy at the time, something that kept the peace. Now it felt like something else entirely. I opened the door without knocking. The room was neat, almost too neat. The desk cleared of clutter in a way that suggested recent attention. Richard had always been organized, but this was different. This was curated. Controlled. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, shutting out the faint sounds of their voices from the kitchen. For a moment I simply stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the details. The leather chair. The polished surface of the desk. The framed certificates on the wall. The life he had built, the identity he had carefully maintained. I walked slowly to the desk and placed my hand on its surface, feeling the cool wood beneath my palm. Then I sat down, not hesitantly, not as a guest, but as someone who had every right to be there. I opened the top drawer. Inside were neatly arranged folders, labeled in his precise handwriting. Accounts. Property. Legal. I pulled one out at random and opened it, flipping through the pages with steady hands. Numbers. Statements. Transfers. The same pattern I had seen on my phone, now laid out in ink and paper, deliberate and undeniable. He had not just moved money. He had documented it, structured it, prepared it. I set the folder down and reached for another, this one labeled with a date from several months ago. Inside were copies of documents I recognized immediately. The ones I had signed at the kitchen table. The ones he had described as routine updates. I read them now, slower, more carefully. The language was clear once I allowed myself to see it. Authorization. Access. Consolidation. Words that sounded harmless when explained casually, but carried weight when placed in the right order. I closed the folder and leaned back in the chair, letting the pieces settle into place. This had never been spontaneous. Not the email. Not the empty account. Not even the woman downstairs. This was a process. A sequence. A plan executed step by step while I continued to live inside it, unaware. A soft knock came at the door, followed by Richard's voice, controlled but no longer entirely steady. Margaret, we need to talk. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I picked up another document and scanned it briefly, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to shift the balance again. Then I spoke, my tone calm, unchanged. The door is open. He stepped inside, closing it behind him with a quiet click. For a moment, he remained standing, as if unsure whether to approach or maintain distance. I did not look up right away. I let him stand there, waiting, adjusting to a space where he was no longer in control. Finally, I lifted my gaze to meet his. You were thorough, I said, not as a compliment, not as an accusation, just as an observation. His expression tightened slightly. I did what was necessary, he replied. Necessary. The word settled between us, heavy with assumption. Necessary for whom? Necessary for what? I nodded once, acknowledging the word without agreeing to it. You transferred everything, I continued, tapping lightly on the folder in front of me. You changed access. You prepared the documents months ago. He shifted his weight, a small movement, but enough to show the strain beneath his composure. It was cleaner this way, he said. Cleaner. Another word chosen carefully, as if language itself could justify action. I leaned forward slightly, folding my hands on the desk. You assumed I would not look closely, I said. Again, not a question. He did not respond. He did not need to. The silence confirmed it. That had been part of the plan as well. My trust. My routine. My willingness to let him handle things. I let the silence settle for a moment longer, then reached into my purse and placed my phone on the desk between us. The screen lit up as I tapped it, displaying the call I had made earlier. A name. A firm. Someone he recognized. His eyes moved to it, and for the first time I saw something break through completely. Not anger. Not irritation. Something sharper. Uncertainty. You should have considered one thing, I said quietly, before you decided to make everything so clean. He looked at me, waiting, no longer certain of the ground beneath him. I held his gaze steadily. You were not the only one who knew how this worked. The room felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the balance had shifted in a way he could not ignore. He had planned every step, every transfer, every document, every move. But he had planned it based on who he thought I was. And that version of me no longer existed. I picked up the folder again and closed it with a soft, deliberate motion, aligning it neatly on the desk. Then I stood, smoothing my coat once more, out of habit, out of control, out of something deeper than either of those. This is not finished, I said. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly. And this time when I walked past him toward the door, he did not try to stop me. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching as the certainty he had built began to unravel, piece by piece, in a way he had not anticipated and could no longer control. I did not go back to the kitchen after leaving the study. I walked straight to the front door, picked up my suitcase and stepped outside without another word. The morning air felt colder now, sharper against my skin, but it grounded me in a way the house no longer could. I did not look back. Not at the windows. Not at the door. Not at the life that had just been rearranged behind me. I placed my suitcase in the trunk of a waiting car I had already arranged and slid into the back seat, giving the driver a simple address downtown. He nodded and pulled away from the curb without conversation. That was something I appreciated. Silence when it is chosen is different from silence when it is forced. This was mine. As the neighborhood disappeared behind me, I rested my hands in my lap and allowed myself to think clearly, without interruption, without performance. Richard believed he had removed me from the equation, that I would react emotionally, that I would argue, that I would try to reclaim what he had already decided was no longer mine. He had prepared for conflict. What he had not prepared for was precision. The car moved through familiar streets, past places that had once felt permanent. The grocery store we used every Sunday, the cafe where we met friends, the park where we used to walk in the evenings. All of it still there, unchanged, indifferent to what had happened. That was the thing about the world. It does not shift just because your life does. It continues. And if you are not careful, it will move forward without you. I was not going to let that happen. When we arrived at the building, I stepped out, paid the driver, and walked inside with the same steady pace I had maintained since leaving the house. The lobby was quiet, polished, the kind of place that felt removed from personal chaos. That was why I chose it. The receptionist greeted me by name, already expecting me. I nodded once and took the elevator to the 4th floor. When the doors opened, I walked down the hallway and stopped in front of a glass door with a name etched in clean, professional lettering. I did not hesitate. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The office smelled faintly of paper and coffee, a familiar combination that carried a sense of order. My attorney stood as I entered, offering a firm, respectful nod. He had known me for years, though not in this capacity. Not like this. Margaret, he said, his voice calm, measured. I reviewed your message. I placed my bag on the chair beside me and sat down across from him, folding my hands neatly on the desk. Then you know why I am here, I replied. He nodded once, sliding a folder toward me. I started pulling records as soon as you called, he said. There are some things you should see. I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside, my eyes moving steadily across the lines. Transfer confirmations, count authorizations, property filings. All of it aligned with what I had already seen, but here it was organized, interpreted, placed into a context that extended beyond assumption. He moved everything under his control, my attorney continued. But not all of it was legally his to move. I looked up at him then, not surprised but attentive. Explain, I said simply. He adjusted his glasses and pointed to a section of the document. A significant portion of these funds originated from your inheritance, he said. That changes how they can be handled. He may have had access, but that does not grant ownership. I listened carefully, each word settling into place with quiet precision. This was the difference. Richard had focused on access, on control, on execution, but he had overlooked origin, structure, legal boundaries that do not disappear just because someone decides to ignore them. And the house, I asked. Joint ownership, my attorney replied. But there are clauses tied to how financial decisions were made over the years. If we can establish misuse or misrepresentation, that opens another path. I closed the folder slowly, aligning it with the edge of the desk just as I had done with everything else that morning. Order mattered now more than ever. Not for comfort but for clarity. What do you need from me? I asked. He did not hesitate. Documentation. Anything that shows the original source of funds, any communication related to those account changes, anything that suggests you were not fully informed. I nodded once. You will have it, I said. And I meant it. Not because I had planned for this but because I had lived it. The records were there. The patterns. The signatures. The quiet moments where decisions were made without full transparency. They existed. They always had. I stood up, taking the folder with me, feeling its weight in my hands. Not heavy. Not overwhelming. Just enough to remind me that this was no longer abstract. This was tangible. Actionable. Real. We will begin immediately, my attorney added. I met his eyes briefly, then nodded. Good, I said. So will I. As I turned to leave the office, I felt something settle inside me once more. Not anger. Not revenge. Something more controlled. Direction. Richard had believed this was finished the moment he pressed send on that email. He had believed distance would protect him, that preparation would secure his position. But he had overlooked something simple. He had only prepared for one version of me, and that version no longer existed. I did not go home that day. Not immediately. Instead, I checked into a hotel a few blocks from the office, a place I had stayed at once years ago during a renovation when the house had been temporarily unlivable. Back then it had felt like a disruption. Now it felt like something else entirely. A controlled space. Neutral. Mine for however long I needed it to be. I placed my suitcase on the stand near the window and set the folder from my attorney on the desk, aligning it carefully before sitting down in the chair beside it. The room was quiet. No unfamiliar perfume. No chush objects. No voices drifting in from another room. Just stillness. I opened the folder again and began working through it piece by piece, not quickly, not emotionally, but with the same steady focus I had carried since stepping off that plane. Dates. Signatures. Transfers. Each page confirmed what I already understood, but now it was structured in a way that could not be dismissed. I pulled out my phone and began searching through my emails, filtering by date, by keywords, by anything that might connect the documents in front of me to the conversations I had once accepted without question. It did not take long. There were messages. Subtle. Ordinary. Requests to review something. To sign something. To approve something quickly because he was in the middle of a busy week. I had responded the same way each time. Of course. That sounds fine. Just send it over. I placed the phone down and reached into my bag, pulling out a small notebook I had carried for years, the one where I wrote down reminders, appointments, things that felt too minor to matter at the time. I flipped through the pages slowly, scanning entries from the past 6 months. A meeting here. A note about documents there. Small details, but together they formed a pattern. A timeline. I turned to a blank page and began writing, listing dates, matching them to the documents, connecting each action to a moment I could remember. Not because I needed to understand it emotionally, but because I needed it to be precise. Clear. Unquestionable. Hours passed without interruption. The light in the room shifted from afternoon to early evening, casting longer shadows across the desk, but I did not stop. This was not something that required urgency. It required accuracy. When my phone finally buzzed, I glanced at the screen. Richard. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I silenced it without answering. A message followed almost immediately. Then another. I did not open them. Not yet. Whatever he needed to say now was not information. It was reaction. And reaction in this moment was not useful to me. I set the phone aside and returned to the documents, finishing the list I had started, reviewing it once more before closing the notebook and placing it neatly beside the folder. Everything was there. Every step. Every shift. Every decision that had led to this moment. I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a single breath, slow and controlled, before standing and walking to the window. The city below moved as it always did, steady, unaware, indifferent. Cars passed. People crossed the street. Lights flickered on as evening settled in. It was a reminder of something simple. Life does not pause. It does not wait for you to catch up. You either move with it or you are left behind. I was not going to be left behind. I returned to the desk and picked up my phone again, this time opening the messages. The first was short. We need to talk. The second longer. This does not have to become something complicated. I read them once, then set the phone back down without responding. Complicated. That word again. He still believed complexity was something that could be avoided if handled carefully, if managed correctly. He still believed he could shape the outcome by controlling the conversation. I reached for the folder and opened it one more time, my eyes moving to the section my attorney had pointed out earlier. Inheritance. Origin of funds. Legal boundaries. Words that carried weight not because of how they sounded, but because of what they meant when applied correctly. I closed the folder and placed my hand on top of it, feeling its presence, its certainty. This was no longer about what he had done. That part was already clear. This was about what came next. And what came next would not be determined by his assumptions or his timing or his version of events. It would be determined by structure, by fact, by the quiet accumulation of decisions that he had underestimated. I picked up the phone once more and dialed a number, waiting as it rang. When the call connected, I spoke calmly, clearly, without hesitation. I am ready to proceed, I said. A pause on the other end, then a response I expected. Confirmation. Next steps. Action. I listened, nodding slightly, then ended the call and set the phone back in its place. The room remained quiet. Ordered. Controlled. I gathered the documents, closing the folder with deliberate care, and placed it back on the desk. Tomorrow would begin something new. Not loud. Not chaotic. But precise. And for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible shift in expression. Not a smile. Not satisfaction. Just recognition. He had tried to remove me from the story. What he had actually done was give me a reason to rewrite it entirely. The next morning began quietly, the way most things do before they change permanently. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the soft gray light filling the hotel room in a way that felt neutral, almost detached from everything that had happened the day before. For a moment I sat at the edge of the bed, my hands resting lightly on my knees, not thinking, not reacting, just allowing the stillness to settle around me. Then I stood, dressed with the same measured precision I had carried through every step of this process, and gathered the documents from the desk, placing them carefully into my bag. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just movement forward. By the time I arrived at the office, everything was already in motion. My attorney greeted me with a nod, his desk now organized with additional files, notes, and printed confirmations. We have started the process, he said simply, sliding a document toward me. I read it carefully. Legal notices. Formal requests. Immediate actions taken to review and freeze certain transactions pending investigation. Each line was structured, controlled, deliberate. This was not emotional. This was procedural. I signed where necessary, my hand steady, the pen moving without pause. When I finished, I placed the pen down and looked at him. What happens now? I asked. He did not hesitate. Now we wait for them to respond, he said. And when they do, we proceed based on facts. Facts. That word mattered. Not assumptions. Not narratives. Facts. I nodded once, then stood, collecting my bag again. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. The city moved with its usual rhythm, people stepping into their routines, unaware of the quiet shifts happening beneath the surface of someone else's life. I walked down the sidewalk without urgency, my pace steady, my mind clear. By the time I returned to the house, there was already a change. Subtle but undeniable. The front door was closed, but the energy around it felt different. Tense. Waiting. I stepped inside without knocking, without hesitation, just as I had the day before. Richard was in the living room this time, standing near the window, his posture rigid, his expression no longer composed. Vanessa sat on the edge of the sofa, her earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more uncertain. Papers were spread across the coffee table. My presence did not surprise them. This time, they had been expecting it. I closed the door behind me and set my bag down with the same deliberate care, aligning it beside the chair before turning to face them. No one spoke at first. The silence was different now. Not controlled. Not neutral. Pressured. Richard was the first to break it. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice tight, no longer measured, no longer calm. I looked at him for a moment, then at the papers on the table, then back at him. "I reviewed everything," I said. Simple. Direct. True. He took a step forward, his control slipping just enough to be visible. "The accounts are frozen," he said. "They are asking questions." I nodded once. "That tends to happen," I replied. Vanessa shifted beside him, her eyes moving between us, searching for something to hold on to, some version of certainty that was no longer available to her. "This is unnecessary," Richard continued, the edge in his voice sharpening. "We could have handled this privately." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was amusing, but because it revealed exactly what he still believed. That this was about preference. About convenience. About how things appeared rather than what they were. I walked further into the room, stopping just short of the coffee table, looking down briefly at the documents spread across it. Notices. Requests. Legal language that did not bend to explanation or persuasion. Then I looked back at him. "You already handled it privately," I said. "This is the result." The words settled between us, clear and final. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, the realization catching up to him in real time. This was no longer something he could adjust. No longer something he could manage through conversation. It had moved beyond him. Vanessa stood then, slower this time, her movements no longer confident, her posture no longer relaxed. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at Richard, then at me, as if trying to determine where she belonged in a situation that was no longer stable. I watched her for a moment, then shifted my attention back to him. "You made your decisions," I said quietly. "Now I am making mine." There was no anger in my voice, no raised tone, just certainty, the kind that does not need to be defended. The room remained still for a moment longer, the weight of what had changed settling into every corner of the space. Then I reached for my bag, lifting it with the same calm precision I had carried through every step of this process. I did not wait for a response. I did not ask for one. As I walked toward the door, I paused only briefly, my hand resting lightly on the handle before turning back just enough to meet his eyes one final time. "You thought you removed me," I said. "What you did was remove yourself." And with that I opened the door and stepped outside, the air cool and steady against my skin, the world continuing forward exactly as it always had. Only now I was moving with it on my own terms.